I would like to thank Ljiljana Blagojević and Petar Bojanić for inviting me to speak here today. And I would also like to thank Vladan Đokić, who is supervising the research which also involves this paper. In 1966, Eldo van Eyck famously noticed how society has no form. For an architect, this presented a certain obstacle, namely to building society's counterform. Published 9 years later, the book The Man in the Street of his Team 10 colleague Shadrach Woods also lamented upon the current state of affairs in the West. Woods, still loyal to the vision of social change by means of urbanism, recognized that the city, like the Western world itself, had become a, quote, juxtaposition of would-be entities, set one against the other, each striving to obtain power to impose its own set of rules. What both Van Eyck and Woods were describing was not only the crisis of late modernism and its strive for comprehensive change, nor was it the gradual emergence of atomized and cynical postmodernism, but the fundamental impotence of imagining a new society in a viable manner. A diagnosis for this particular set of symptoms came for the first time in 1983, when Frederick Jameson connected it to a problem of cognitive mapping. Jameson saw cognitive mapping as a synthesis between Louis Althusser and Kevin Lynch, or as a technique of mapping both spatially and socially. As a way of attaining a link between the immediate present and some other more fundamental dimension, or the real of social relations, cognitive mapping represented a vital aspect of radical politics. This referred not only to the detection of the current, capitalist, but also to the vision of alternative, socialist or communist real. In the times of the gradual withdrawal of the left, Jameson still saw some examples relating to what, quote, communism ought to be and could be expected to look like, unquote. And one of these was recognized in socialist Yugoslavia, most likely due to its avant-garde concept of self-management. With the emancipatory strive of socialism duly noted, one might wonder whether forms of cognitive mapping present in Yugoslavia proved more efficient in deconstructing the country than in providing a viable model for a future society. If, as Slavoj Žižek claims, Yugoslavia's end revealed its truth, meaning the explosion of unsustainable compromises accumulated in previous decades, we might wonder if another form of cognitive mapping existed there well beyond the onslaught of the notorious war-riven 1990s. By choosing between Jameson and Žižek, one effectively chooses between two dialectical concepts of the real. The first places the real out there, yet acknowledges its influence here and now. The real defines our present, but must also be thought of in regards to an alternative future. The second sees the real as something that is the fullness of presence, yet in itself a gap. It prevents our societies from achieving closure, but must also be embraced in an eventful moment of radical social change. By oscillating between these two concepts, this paper explores examples of Belgrade late modernist housing designs, Estate Julino Brdo and New Belgrade Block No. 19A. It looks into the ways Belgrade architecture addressed the splits between the modernizing impulses of socialism and the remnants of traditional society, creating temporary aesthetic solutions to their conflicts. I will try to show that while the West was discovering the blindness of its vision, registering the emerging postmodernism, Belgrade late modernism followed an opposite path. First by ignoring and then by manipulating the real, it ultimately provided a fantasy of social totality, in a dangerous balancing act between unification and exclusion. In the same year Van Eyck proclaimed the crisis of cognitive mapping, a competition was held in Belgrade. It involved the location of Julino Brdo, a rocky hill located near Čukarica municipality, which was to house one of many socialist estates built throughout Belgrade at the time. Authored by Milan Lojanica, Borivoje Jovanović and Predrag Cagić, the winning proposal developed the main inputs defined the previous year in an urban plan, namely the two multi-story residential groups placed along concave lines delineating the inner space of community. The solution itself was interpreted in 1969 by the urbanist Vladimir Bielikov. In an issue of Arhitektura Urbanizam magazine, he read it as representative of the most progressive line of current development of Yugoslav architecture and urbanism. Bjelikov's interpretation, just like his cover page for the same issue, reveals a number of typical late modernist motifs, such as the spatial bordering of a community, the dissolution of architectural masses, and the rediscovery of the man as the ultimate measure of professional intervention. This set of elements was seen by Bjelikov, interestingly, as both in agreement with the latest trends abroad and the most direct consequence of the recent policy changes in Yugoslavia. The latter were linked to an ongoing reform, which tended to suppress the overall influence of the socialist state, introducing market laws in country's economy. The winning proposal for Julino Brdo estate involved a rather self-referential dimension, linking its existence solely to the location upon which it was to be built. Unlike late modernist designs from the 1950s and 1960s, such as the Berlin Hauptstadt or the Robin Hood Gardens in London, Julino Brdo lacked a link to a wider urban reality. In itself, the estate clearly featured an absence of cognitive mapping, a lack of reference towards the surrounding areas of Čukarica municipality and the broader context of Belgrade. For the authors of the project, there was a further problem of perception that needed to be addressed. Writing on the design, they described it as a unified body, resisting the single gaze of the observer. The visual overlapping of the four residential clusters, the differences in heights of individual buildings, and the alternating presence of terraces and loggias were there, arguably, to make the composition hard to perceive. At the same time, this body was seen by its authors as merged with the rocky hill of the location. Complementary in their relation, the building and the ground were there to benefit from each other, contributing to a common identity. This set of characteristics clearly combined conflicting strivings. Simultaneously static and dynamic, Julino Brdo compensated a lack of connection to a wider urban reality with the richness of its inherent traits. Yet, its self-referential character could be challenged just in connection to such a contradictory nature. If Julino Brdo failed to map in a direct fashion the real which existed out there, beyond the borders of the rocky hill it stood on, maybe the real of the 1960s Belgrade could have been inscribed in its design in a more abstract fashion, as a union of opposites. To try to detect the real, one should consult studies from the period dealing with Julino Brdo's surrounding area. For example, sociologist Sreten Vujović noticed in 1985 how Čukarica could not be deemed as an urban whole. Its territory was riven with contradictions which placed the average urban standard somewhere between a village and a metropolis. Furthermore, another study showed how Čukarica dominated Belgrade's official statistics in three figures. First, its population was de-agrarized in the first 3 decades of socialism most rapidly. Also, it housed the second highest percentage of migrants coming directly to Belgrade straight from villages, and the lowest figure for migrants arriving from cities. As such, Čukarica was representative of much wider social and economic trends, which marked the development of socialism in Yugoslavia. In the 1930s, Yugoslavia was a backward country and at the margins of Europe, where 77% of all of the residents lived from the land. The introduction of socialism entailed a quantum leap forward, with an authoritarian project of modernization dragging the country by its hair into the 20th century. By 1981, only 19% of Yugoslav residents were employed in agriculture, as opposed to almost 67% in 1948. The share of agriculture in country's GDP fell 3 times in the same period, with the share of industry growing more than twofold. The number of urban residents increased steadily at the expense of rural areas, generally regarded as synonymous with poverty, boredom, and tight social constraints. Yet rapid changes were far from straightforward, leaving huge amounts of people stranded between the poles of traditional and modern. These processes revolved around antagonisms, which prevented the socialist society from achieving closure. The split between the industrial and the agricultural is easily distinguishable in the official statistics. Between 1948 and 1981, the proportion of non-agricultural population was increased 3.5 times, as opposed to the growth of productivity in the economy, which measured only 2.3 times. The former peasant was thus simultaneously the driving force of socialism and the foreign body placed at its center. His low productivity and lack of work ethics were most damaging in regards to the entrepreneurial behavior, seen by many as vital to the functioning of a concept of decentralized self-management economy, especially relevant in the times of the 1960s reforms. On the other hand, the antagonism between urban and rural was much more ambiguous in its effects. Especially relevant here is the case of Belgrade, which due to its booming population and sprawling growth, was one of the favorite themes of those insisting on a transitive state of Yugoslavia's urban environment. Often quoted figures for the 1960s Belgrade, showing that only a third of its residents were actually born in the city, were interpreted as signifying the corruption of urban culture. And yet, having in mind that a number of traits were shared at the time by the urban and rural cultures of Serbia, one is better off avoiding the simplistic opposition between native and migratory and focusing on another aspect of Belgrade's urbanization, vital to the case of Julino Brdo. Belgrade entered the dynamic processes of socialism largely as a dense urban tissue, surrounded by several rings of villages. For the residents of these rural areas, socialism brought a number of different challenges, including the sprawling nature of the city. The villages were targeted both by the homes of migrants built illegally and the construction of socialist housing estates. The latter were built, as their names, Kumodra, Županica, Mirjevo, etc., suggest, on the territories of villages, reducing them to rural enclaves surrounded by high-rise modernist and late modernist designs. The legal basis for this scenario was the infamous 1958 law on nationalization, which stated that all land seen suitable for urban development was to be converted into social property. When new facilities were to be built, former owners were to be reimbursed for their property, either through money or compensation. In 1962, the entire area of the village of Žarkovo was proclaimed eligible for urbanization. This opened the possibility of construction of socialist estates, including Julino Brdo, which was to occupy the rocky hill on its northern border. During 1967, legal procedures were commenced, aiming to reimburse those who lived on the location. Illegal settlers, who built their substandard, infrastructure-scarce homes without permits, largely in late 1950s. The materials present in the historical archives of Belgrade demonstrate how these settlers lived in improvised conditions, with some staying in buildings measuring only 6 square meters per one resident. First offered money to move out of the location, the illegal dwellers engaged the investors of the estate, housing cooperative Betonjerka, in years-long cycles of lawsuits and countersuits, ending the process by eventually moving into new apartments on locations nearby. In all the cases I was able to reconstruct, this process ended in better living conditions being provided for the former illegal settlers, in regards to both the sheer size of awarded apartments and the general urban standard. Moreover, all of the people moved from the location were resettled in the range of approximately 2 kilometers from their initial homes. In contrast, those who just owned land in Julino Brdo were expedited through the legal procedure and simply awarded cash instead of new land. These were the residents of Žarkova, some of their peasants or their descendants. If any one of the people involved in the process wanted to continue or commence some form of agricultural activity, he or she would most surely face difficulties due to the shrinking amount of available land in Belgrade. Not surprisingly, a question of accessibility of agricultural land was raised in 1975 at the Executive Council of Belgrade, the highest governmental body. orthogonal arrangement of New Belgrade's blocks, present in the proposals of their fellow competitors. Henceforth, the motif, which has been time and again regarded by critics as a major event in Belgrade architecture, the arrangement of steeply roofed residential buildings in the center of the block, involved a diagonally directed platform, lifting the pedestrian routes one floor above ground. In typical late modernist manner, the platform handled all the functions complementary to that, an area segregated from most traffic. Blocks number 22 and 23. But the area is something which is to be gazed upon, a visually strong composition worthy of attention. In contrast, the authors of block number 19A envisaged the gaze stretching beyond the space of New Belgrade, looking alive at late modernist self-management area. Block number 19A cognitively mapped the valuable elements of Belgrade's panorama. The authors offered the residents of the block an image of Belgrade's historical core, seen by critics as finally providing the point worthy of user identification, hopefully strong enough to reverse the observed trends of alienation and non-participation in local forms of self-management. In the context of the ongoing national revival, one should be surprised that the cathedral church, Michael Young, found its place among the elements of Belgrade's history, seen as referred to by the diagonal arrangement of the block. Despite the fact that the party did its best to keep national religious organizations, including the Serbian Orthodox Church, at marginal social reform, the shift of the 1970s paved the way for the resurgence of religious feelings. Detected already in the middle of the decade, the growing number of Yugoslav refugees sentiments little to do, as Marija Ninčalić explains, with religion itself, but rather with participation in national traditions. If the gaze towards the shining bell tower of the cathedral church proves to stretch for the residents of the block, its facades provided them with another point of national reference. These were comprised of a typical element, a two-layer panel with whitish concrete at the outer side, produced through the application of white crusher-run aggregate and cement. With its twin narrow windows, the typical element was defined by as belonging to the national tradition, with its orientation towards the other bank of the river. Block number 19A provided a spatial and social mapping, worthy of the term ideology. Contrary to Western, postmodern space orientation and indifference, famously attributed to Jameson in Western Europe, Belgrade architecture found a way of providing an illusion of comprehensive social cohesion, based, nonetheless, on the disillusion of wider, supranatural realities. In the society riven with the real, recognized in economic hardships, social repression, and declining enthusiasm towards the official concept of self-management, the block provided an aesthetic solution to existing antagonisms, but distinctly different from the one of Julino Brdo. Here, abstract merging of the opposites was replaced with much more concrete scenario of unification along national lines. This was a typical example of an ideological response to the real, of not referring to it in a radical, eventful fashion. The chief investor of the block number 19A was the Yugoslav army, the last institution of federal significance to remain after the political shifts of the mid-1970s. As one of the largest investors of New Belgrade, the army housed there its multinational personnel, contributing to New Belgrade's status as the, quote, most Yugoslav, unquote, of all of Belgrade's municipalities. The frequency of changes of army personnel in a single location prompted authors of the block